So, hi everyone. It's great to be back to B'nai Israel and Life Online and wherever you're from. For those who by chance do not know who I am Netta Asner-Minster and I'm the Shlicha of B'nai Israel congregation. This is actually my first official session I'm doing for my second year of Shlichut. I just got back last Friday from Israel after a month being there, and I'm very excited. So, just some technical things before Chelsea, who is our guest for today, will be leading and speaking and leading the discussion. So just technical stuff. First, please stay muted, which I see that most of you or all of you already know very well. We're all Zoom. We're used to this Zoom already, and feel free to use the chat as well. There'll be a lot of discussion here and a lot of things that will. I'm sure bring a lot of thoughts and emotions, so feel free to use the chat for questions and we will have time for that at the end. As you see, I'm recording it and it will be put on YouTube afterwards as well, so if there's an issue with you don't want to be seen or whatever, then that's why I'm letting you know now in advance. So this session, if you've received my email, is a continuation in a sense from the Unorthodox sessions that happened last May. As a result, and from feedback I received, what I decided to do was a series called Women in Judaism, and this is the first session of that, and is about women in the Tanach. And the next one, and I'll also share about this at the end, will be in November, and so you see, it's really encompassing the whole year. And it will be about women and their representation in Israel and the US, so comparing the different movements and their practices and their experiences. And there'll be a panel in November, and I will obviously notify you about that as well. And before I introduce Chelsea properly, I just wanted to say thank you and do a little promotion for two things, and then we will begin. So I want to thank the Sisterhood and the Men's Club of B'nai Israel for partnering and sharing the information about these sessions. And I also want to take advantage to share one thing from B'nai and one thing also a personal project. To invite you all to take part in a special Elul reflection project in which, in preparation towards the high holidays, B'nai will be sending every day 150 words of people's experiences regarding either life quake, so something that's shaken you this past year, or something that you haven't accomplished, or so anyways, more information about that will be in the chat and the link that I'll share, but they're really looking for more people to contribute, so feel free to sign up for that. And the other thing is the project Life Online. Rotem is my fellow Shlicha who's part of that project. It's a bunch of us community shlichim who have come together to create content, which some of you know, whether it's cooking or Hebrew or history or Judaism and stuff like this. There really is a wide variety of content, and I will be putting the links for that as well in the chat. I'm in charge of the weekly email, so I promise you, I recommend you to join that. So there's a link to the Facebook group and the weekly email, and I'll be putting that chat when Chelsea begins to speak. So the reason I thought of this specific, to start with this specifically, as the first session for Women in Judaism was because also people expressed interest, but also because a few years ago I got this book from my Saba, my grandfather. It's called Nashim Tanach, which means women in the Bible, or women in the Tanach. And through just a brief look at it, I saw, known women, but also I saw people who were nameless as well. And I always thought, are there themes? Is there a role for representation of women in the Tanakh? And I met Chelsea originally on a birthright trip, but during a year she spent in Israel, part of the Dorot Fellowship, she actually developed a theory that she'll be sharing part of today, and I'll let her elaborate more on that. And I will also now share her biography, her little bio. But that is how this subject is thought of in the first place, and why it was chosen as the first one to dive into the subject of women in Judaism, basically. Great. So Chelsea Feuchs is a rising third-year rabbinical student at Hebrew Union College. Originally from Goldens Bridge, New York, Chelsea attended Brown University, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts in Judaic Studies. Upon graduation, she became a Join for Justice Fellow and worked for 2 years as a labor organizer in Massachusetts. Chelsea subsequently became a Dorot Fellow in Israel and lived for a year in Jerusalem. During that time, Chelsea read the whole Tanach with feminist commentary. Before beginning rabbinical school, Chelsea worked for the Association of Reformed Zionists of America. And with after that whole introduction, I will now put the spotlight on Chelsea to properly begin our discussion for today. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this and joining us.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to get to teach and also to meet your community again. Yeah, this is just very, very exciting. So you'll see me looking off to the side. I've got like a 2-screen setup here, so sorry about that. But yeah, as Netta said, tonight we're talking about women in the Tanach, and this really became like a real passion of mine in that year in Israel, where I did a project where I read the whole Tanach with feminist commentary. So I read the book itself from cover to cover, but also other feminist and female writers on the topic, as well as having a weekly chavruta, like paired study session where we focused on feminist issues within the text. And the driving question really for the whole year was, what are women doing in this text? And so in response to that, I did my reading and I sort of made all these like note cards about the women that were in there. And I tried to see if I could figure out what their roles were. And I ended up identifying several categories that women in the Tanakh fall into in terms of their roles. And I'm going to share 3 of those with you tonight. And I just want to sort of make a note before we start that categorization is not an inherently feminist act, right? It sort of flattens out all people, but in this case, we're talking about women. But this is really meant to be a starting point to increase engagement with lesser known figures in the text. I think a lot of people could name 10 or so women from the Tanakh very easily who they know. But it's a lot harder to sort of expand beyond that. And there's actually hundreds of women in the book. And so this is really meant to be more of a framework for how to think about what women are doing in this text. The 3 categories that I'm going to share tonight are going to go from what I like to think of as most palatable to the modern feminist reader to least palatable to the modern feminist reader. So we'll kick off really strong with like an exciting category, and then it'll get a little bit more problematic from there. So I'm going to share my screen so that we all have the text in front of us. Netta, yeah? Good? Okay, cool. So throughout these 3 categories, at the end of each of these texts, there are discussion questions, and that's a great time for you to unmute yourself or to write something in the chat if you want to participate in the conversation, which I would love. That is the goal. So starting off, our first category is women who do what men alone cannot. And so these are women whose traits and actions can be read as direct commentaries on the men in their life. And I think that the best example of this is Rivka. She's the second of our matriarchs, probably pretty well known. As I think all of my fellow students at rabbinical school could tell you, I just love her. Like I'm obsessed. She's my favorite, and I just think that she is such an amazing character. So a little bit of background on Rebecca. Rebecca is one of the few women whose birth is even announced in the Tanakh at all. She enters the scene right after the Akedah, when Isaac is bound by his father Abraham and nearly sacrificed. So that really is like the pinnacle of Isaac's passivity. And Rebecca comes onto the scene as this like strong and very active character. Abraham's servant goes looking for a wife for Isaac. He sits down by a well, and Rebecca comes like right away, offers him water, and then offers to water all 10 of his camels, which you've seen humps on camels. That's where they're storing it. That's no small feat. Very strong, also very kind. In addition to this type of strength, she sort of bucks other trends by being one of the few women who consents to her own marriage in the text, which is just awesome. And she talks directly with God. She doesn't just go through her husband to be like, hey, would you mind asking God what's going on? Like, my womb really hurts when I'm pregnant. There are two sons fighting in there. They'll come into the scene in a moment. Instead, she sort of speaks directly to God and hears God's plan for the future and becomes the one to execute God's plan. And for that reason, I think that there's a really strong argument that while we commonly say that our tradition passed from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, if we're talking about active players here, it really passed from Abraham to Rebecca to Jacob. So together we're going to focus on a text where her activity is directly in conflict with Isaac's passivity. And that's when she secures his blessing for Jacob, her favorite son and God's favorite son, over Esau. So is there anyone who would like to read the text just so that you're not hearing my voice all the time? It's up on the screen here, verses 8 through 17, and you don't need to read the bold words any differently.
Chelsea, maybe if you made it bigger.
Bigger, sure. Yeah. I'll zoom in on the English too. I assume that's the favored language.
Yeah.
Okay. If there's no one who wants to read, no problem, I'm happy to, but I just want to hold for another second if there's anyone who wants to unmute and give it a go.
Now, my son, listen to my voice as I command you. Go please to the flock and fetch me 2 good goats, and I will make them into a tasty dish for your father, such as he likes. Then you will take it to your father to eat, in order that he will bless you before his death. Jacob answered his mother Rebekah, but my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am smooth. Perhaps my father will touch me, and I will appear in his eyes as a trickster, and I will bring upon myself a curse and not a blessing. But his mother said to him, upon me shall your curse be, my son. Just listen to my voice and go fetch them for me. So he went and fetched them and brought them to his mother, and his mother made a tasty dish such as his father liked. And Rebekah took the best clothes of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and she dressed Jacob, her younger son, in them. And she covered his hands and the hairless part of his neck with the skins of the goats. Then she put the tasty dish and the bread that she prepared in the hand of her son, Jacob.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being brave and volunteering to read. I really appreciate it. Okay, so zooming out so that we can see the whole text. Great. So what I bolded here were what I viewed to be the active phrases and verbs that are in this text. So I'll just go over those really quickly. She starts by saying, I command you to her son, to Jacob. Then she does this amazing thing that a bunch of other women do throughout the text too, when the men around them are kind of being scaredy cats. She says, your curse will be on me. Like anything bad that's scaring you off from doing what I'm saying, that is definitely the right thing to do, I'm the one who will have the consequences, so don't worry about it. Then she insists that he listen to her. And then she makes a dish. She takes the clothes of Esau. She dresses Jacob with them. She covers his hands with the fur from the goat so that he feels hairy. She puts the dish in his hand, and she has prepared that dish and the bread. So a ton of active verbs going on here and like really commanding phrases. So my first question about this is, how does this emphasis on Rebecca's power and agency intersect with your expectations of women's behavior in the Bible? right? It might be that this totally jives with it. You thought of women as like very powerful and active. It may be that it's a real surprise and you kind of thought that mostly the men were in charge, or anything in between. So whether you want to unmute yourself to jump into the discussion or write something in the chat, both options are great.
Feel free to also raise your hand if you know how to do that in the participants, and I'll be happy to call on you if you don't want to just unmute yourself, but you can also just unmute yourself.
All right, we have Rotem. Yeah.
I would say that I always felt a bit miffed, I guess would be the word, that the first, like the first strong woman that we see, more or less, is a woman that goes behind her husband's back. She pitches her two sons against each other. She's really meddling and not very, I don't know. I always saw this story as pretty problematic. The fact that both parents have an obvious favorite son, and the fact that it's a very dysfunctional family in large is just, it's sad to see that, a woman's role in that is just to further complicate matters, I guess.
Absolutely. I really, really appreciate that comment, Rotem. I took a class this summer about like the family in ancient Israel, like much more of an archaeological based class. And I think up until that point, I hadn't really understood like the economic realities behind what it meant to like have a favored child who gets blessed, who gets more property, like not at all to apologize for or explain away all the problematic parts of this. But it definitely, it struck me as very interesting, like how far my mindset is from that one. And maybe there's something to be explained there that just doesn't compute in our world. But at the same time, we're meant to read this text as modern readers and relate to it. So it's a very, very fair critique. I saw one other hand that was raised, but maybe it got put down.
No, it's I still see it. It's Laura Jacobs. So I'll lower the hand and feel free to unmute yourself.
I did. Thank you. You asked whether we were surprised that she was so forceful and so forth. Well, of course, we meet Rebecca very early on. By the way, I always thought of, in my older years, when I could understand better, I sort of thought of the Torah as a lesson in dysfunctional families. I mean, there are just so many of them. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
By modern standards. Anyway, so we meet her very early on in the narrative, or relatively early on. And so therefore, I can't say that I was surprised, because I didn't have much. I mean, she was somebody I came to know so soon that I had no other particular basis for expectations of what a woman would do. So, I don't, like the other person, I don't approve of what she did, but she didn't ask me. Therefore, I can't say that I'm surprised.
Yeah, that's a very good point. She does come early on, and also, this has been pointed out by several people before, so you may well know this, but like not a single firstborn son actually gets the birthright in all of Genesis. It just never happens. Right? The first brothers, one kills the other. Like, talk about dysfunctional families. This might be one of the better situations to be in, because they do ultimately reconcile. But yes, I think that's a great point, that it's sort of part of a broader theme of dysfunction.
Daughters-in-law seducing fathers-in-law.
That as well. Yeah. Okay, and then last question on this, and maybe we'll just take one answer. so that we move along to the next category, is how does Rebecca's behavior contrast with Isaac's? And what do you think we learn from this tension?
If you don't know how to raise your hand, you can just unmute yourself and start speaking.
All right. If there's no one who wants to jump in, no problem at all. I will just say none of these questions are meant to be leading. There's no right answer. So it's totally just whatever your opinion or what speaks to you. I guess I'll just say that I think it's worthwhile having women in the text whose behavior really is a direct commentary on the men around them. It sort of reinforces the idea for me that we get with the first man and woman, that she's supposed to be like Ezer Kenegdo, like his helper, but like sort of like against him, not against in a contradictory way, but against, like, there are other traits that she's bringing to the table that he doesn't have. And I feel like we see that play out in other relationships. So other like honorable mentions that I have for this category of women would be Esther, right? She is like pious and does the right thing and all of that. And she's married to Ahasuerus, who is like a drunken king who doesn't really get what's going on. And Devorah as well, a great female judge that we have, who next to Barak, a male counterpart, really has this like bravery and sort of, she's very self-assured in a way that he doesn't quite demonstrate. So moving on to the next category.
Chelsea, there's just 2 comments in the chat, maybe about
Great.
About what you just said.
Great. Another idea for me of a brave woman. Oh yes, Pharaoh's daughter. Absolutely, Shifra and Puah. Daughters of Slofachad. Yes, I think that they are very brave women. I actually ended up putting them under a different category, which I'm not getting into tonight, about women who sort of subvert expectations. Because I think Shifra and Puah and Bat Paro, all of the women who helped deliver Moses to safety, are really like undermining this decree and this world around them. That is so okay with violence that they're rejecting. And in part, they get to reject it because no one suspects women of being a real danger. And they are not a danger in a violent way, but a danger to the system that they're trying to put in place. I think that that is awesome. And I love seeing more women get mentioned. Okay. So the next category that we have is what I call unredeemable women. You might also call them like villainous. They are more problematic to the feminist reader because they're villains, but they have like power and agency in this way that I think is still important and puts them in kind of like a middle category. So these are women who hold power, but not in a way that the Tanach approves of. And really what happens with a lot of them is an abuse of their power. Their power is being used for the wrong purpose. Generally, these women have to be killed, often in really disturbing scenes. And so it is not a surprise that our primary example of this is Jezebel. She is a foreign princess that marries King Ahab and becomes a queen within the Israelite nation. She has such a laundry list of things that she does wrong, but I'll just highlight a few. One is that she goes on this like rampage, killing off prophets of Hashem. Like there's sort of warring ideologies here, different religions that she's looking to bring in, foreign worship, and so she's slaughtering these prophets of Hashem. And she has a specific rivalry with Elijah, of Eliyahu, Hanavi, like a really great figure that we revere, and she's like his arch nemesis. And it sort of culminates in this weird like barbecue off, where it's like the prophets of Baal versus the prophets of Hashem try to like smoke a piece of meat, like a sacrifice. And anyway, it's an interesting scene if you want to read it at some point. Another thing that's important to note, two other things. One is that she meets, I think, the most gruesome death in the entire Tanach. Maybe there's a tie for that, of another woman in the book of Judges. But anyway, she is thrown out of a window, stomped on by horses, eaten by dogs, and then only her skull, hands, and feet remain. And not being buried at all is like one of the worst fates that you can sort of experience within the ancient world. In addition, one thing that I want to note is that Jezebel, like the term, has a very sexual connotation in our culture. It's not really used so much anymore to insult a woman that you want to like insult for her sexuality, but it definitely used to be. And there's like a feminist publication of that name trying to reclaim it. I think that a lot of that stems from the scene right before her death, when Jezebel is putting on her makeup. And people sort of have projected onto that she may have been trying to entice someone so that they don't kill her and give the justice that's due to her. But I'm convinced by a different reading of that text where she's painting her eyes with kohl and putting up her hair and looking beautiful because she's a queen and she's going to go to her death as a queen. So I'm not sure that the sexuality that's read into that is really fair, also because she's surrounded by eunuchs in the room where she is, so she wasn't realistically going to entice any of them. Anyway, with all of that background, we are going to dive into the worst thing that Jezebel does. It seems to be, according to the text, which might surprise you because it doesn't seem quite as bad as like mass killing of prophets, but we're going to jump into the text here that's from 1 Kings chapter 21. So I'll zoom in. If I could get a volunteer to read the English.
I'll read. Shall I read?
Thank you.
His wife Jezebel came to him and asked him, "Why are you so dispirited that you won't eat?" So he told her, "I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and proposed to him, 'Sell me your vineyard for money, or if you prefer, I'll give you another vineyard in exchange.' But he answered, 'I will not give my vineyard to you.' His wife Jezebel said to him, 'Now is the time to show yourself king over Israel. Rise and eat something and be cheerful. I will get the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite for you.' So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with a seal, and sent the letters to the elders and the nobles who lived in the same town with Naboth. In the letters she wrote as follows: 'Proclaim a fast and seat Naboth at the front of the assembly, and seat two scoundrels opposite him, and let them testify against him. You have reviled God and king. Then take him out and stone him to death.' His townsmen, the elders and nobles who lived in his town, did as Jezebel had instructed them, just as was written in the letters she had sent them."
Awesome.
Is there more? Justin?
That's it for now. Thank you very much for reading that. So just to recap, Jezebel's husband is super upset because someone won't sell him his vineyard. And Jezebel's like, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." And she comes up with false testimony against the man who won't sell, and then gets people to lie and then stone him to death. Clearly not great. A little bit surprising that this is considered like the worst of the things that she does, seeing as just one person dies as opposed to killing off many. But there's another important text related to this that I want to highlight for us that is earlier on. It's actually before the monarchy in Israel ever gets established. And the Israelites are begging Samuel, the prophet at the time, "Please give us a king over us." And Samuel is warning them about what might happen if you put a monarchy in place. So with that, we will scroll down to just 4 verses from the book of Samuel, if someone would like to read that.
I can read.
Great, thank you.
He said, "This will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will appoint them as his chiefs of thousands and of fifties, or they will have to plow his fields, reap his harvest, and make his weapons and the equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize your choice fields, vineyards, and olive groves, and give them to his courtiers.
Thank you so much for reading. So, among the many possible abuses of power that are warned about, verse 14 is most relevant to what happens with Jezebel.
Right.
So I have 2 questions to ask about this. The first, well, first things first. Given Jezebel's previous misdeeds, killing off all these prophets, her rivalry with Elijah, why is the stealing of this vineyard considered the apex of her escalating evil ways? And again, not a leading question. It's whatever you might think about it.
Well, I'm curious. It's really not Jezebel? I mean, Jezebel is terrible here, but who's really terrible are the elders and nobles in the town who go along with this. And she's subverting the entire government in that sense. So, I mean, I don't know if that's the apex of why, but I fault them much more than I do her.
That's a great point. That's a great point. She's brought a lot of other people into this plan. And also, right, stoning is an activity that isn't done by 1 or 2 executioners, right? It's a group execution. So there's a lot of people getting involved in what she's doing. I think that's a great point for why this might be so terrible. Any other thoughts about how terrible Jezebel is?
Well, the vineyard is the person's way of making a living and also passing something down to his children. So she's really stealing his livelihood and his whole identity in a sense.
Yeah, that's another great point, that like this is someone's, probably they inherited it from their family and they wanted to pass it down to the next generation, and she's really like wiping out that possibility. It's a pretty big deal. Like, one of the worst punishments that you can get is to have your line just erased from the future. Like a lot of this text is really concerned, like the Tanach in general is very concerned with your name living on in the future. And she's taking away, like she's doing like intergenerational harm. Yeah. Maybe one more thought on that.
I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with the scoundrelness, a new word, of the elders and nobles. It seems that she led them into it. And I think that's also part of her sin, is that she caused others to sin, that she led others who may have been more than happy to do it, mind you. I'm not, I don't know. But to cause others to take on that guilt and that sin, I think is a pretty terrible thing.
Yeah. I think that that's a great point, right? If she was the only one doing the bad stuff beforehand, that's one thing, but to implicate so many other people in morally and ethically like bad actions is very, very serious. So thank you so much for all of your thoughts on that. My second question about this is maybe a little bit less about what's going on in the text and a little bit more about how we interact with women like this culturally, which is that Jezebel is referred to in common culture with sexual connotations. But I think that this misinterprets the biblical text. So why do you think this insult became associated with her character? And if anyone wants to write in the chat, if that feels easier or more comfortable.
I mean, I think we have a society that sees women in only two roles, Madonnas and whores. So if she's bad, she's got to be a whore and have sexual connotations.
I think that's a really, really unfortunate and good point. Let's see, perhaps because she tried to take on a traditionally male role by using her husband's seal. I think that is really smart. There's like a lot of discomfort about women going into male roles. And so then maybe highlighting sexuality around that is like some type of reaction or counter, or something's going on there. All right, we'll leave just a little bit longer for any last thoughts. Okay, and we will move on to, before we do, I like to end or to include some honorable mentions in this category, or like dishonorable mentions, I guess, for this category would make more sense. Which would be just like a lesser known trope in here is there are Midianite and Moabite women throughout the Torah who are seen as real threats because their sexuality, it's believed, will lead Israelite men astray and away from God. So whether it's Cosby, this like princess who I think I was talking with Netta about this before. I like to say she got shish kebabbed by Pinchas, who's one of our heroes in the text for doing that. He drives a spear through her and her Israelite male lover. There's like a lot of concern about foreign women, their influence, their sexuality, and that also falls into this category, as do characters like Zeresh, Haman's wife, who might be a little bit better known. So moving on to the third category, and one of the most problematic one that I can think of that I'll be sharing tonight, is women who define boundaries. Let me just check the chat. Judith would like to make a comment about Rebecca. No problem. Please unmute yourself before we move on too far from the first woman who we got to meet.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention, I think that Rebecca's putting the emphasis on Jacob over Esau, it does come from the discussion she had with God earlier in the chapter, in which she talks to God, and the Lord answered her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 separate people shall issue from your body. One people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So it seems that she is thinking, at least, that she's acting out this prophecy by making these choices about her 2 sons. So it takes it a little bit out of the realm of just family dysfunction or favoritism into something that she thinks is sort of a command from God in a sense.
That's a great point, and one that I definitely think about a lot as like a big Rivka fangirl. Not that I want to excuse everything, but I do think that that's real. She had a direct conversation with God about what is supposed to happen, and then she made it happen. Why she and Isaac never had a discussion about this, I don't know. Or maybe they did and he was obstinate, who knows. The Tanach is sort of famously very laconic and doesn't let you know more than it wants to. But you make a fantastic point. And we're actually going to jump back to the book of Genesis, so that was a good segue back, and talk about Dinah, who I view as one of the women who helps define boundaries. So, but just a little bit of background on this category first, is that there's like a preoccupation within the Tanakh with defining like the in-group, who are the Israelites, who are the descendants of Abraham, who are the followers of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, and the others. And there's actually a particular emphasis with this in the Levitical texts, which is really concerned about divisions between like clean and unclean. So even though we're going to get into a specific woman in her story, there's a lot of unnamed women in this category who are more like a woman whose situation you might find yourself in. So I'll do the honorable mentions up front, which is the Sota woman, which is a woman who's believed to have cheated on her husband, and she has to go through this whole big ritual to prove whether or not she did. And then also just a menstruating woman, like when a woman is menstruating, she, is allowed and not allowed in certain areas, to touch certain things, to be in contact with certain holy things. So there's a lot of concern with boundaries and separation just in general in the text. Dina's story might be sort of an interesting one to find in this category, because I originally thought of it as a story of victimhood. Because at least in traditional readings, although I know the Red Tent has sort of put into question what exactly happened between Dina and Shechem. In the original story, she is raped. And then, just to give an overview before we look at a couple of passages, Dina goes out. A man takes her and lays with her by force. And then that man falls in love with her and wants his father, Hamor, who we're going to read about, to secure her as his bride. He falls in love with her and he wants to be her husband. So his father goes to negotiate with Jacob and Dina's brothers. And they lie to him about their plans. They say, no problem, you can, we'll integrate with you, just get circumcised. So all the men get circumcised. And then on the third day, which is known biblically and Talmudically to be the most painful day after circumcision, they come in, kill all the men in the town, take Dina, end of story. That's a lot if you haven't heard it before. Although I think my pacing is similar to the Tanach because it doesn't give a ton of details. But the thing that really happens here is like Dina's narrative is not really put at the center. This happens to her and then men take care of everything else that goes on. You never hear from her again after this. And that sort of struck me as odd. If this was really about victimhood, then shouldn't we be focusing more on her? And if it were really about vengeance, I would think that the part where they are vengeful would take up more space. I actually think what's happening here is it's focusing in on the men in the story and the root of the men's anxieties in this story, which is about creating boundaries. So Jacob, as you probably know, has 12 sons in addition to his daughter. And he is further away from his family of origin than anyone else has gone so far. He has so many kids that it's not clear that they could all marry within the same clan that he comes from, which is what has happened up until this point. It's a lot of cousins getting married, basically. And so Jacob needs to maintain being his own nation and his children being their own nation, while also making decisions to marry outside of just their clan. And just at this moment where there's sort of the most anxiety about how that's going to happen, Shechem, the man who lies with Dina, makes it clear that Jacob and his family might not be fully in control of what their future may be. And their hold over that future is kind of tenuous, or at least it's going to be challenged. And so that's a lot of background. But with that, we're going to delve into two chunks of the text that are within this story and then some questions about it. So if I could get someone to read all of the English section, even though there's a bit of a jump between verse 10 and verse 30.
I'll read it.
Thank you. Sorry, let me go up a little. There we go.
Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but since his sons are in the field with his cattle, Jacob kept silent until they came home. Then Shechem's father Hamor came out to Jacob to speak to him. Meanwhile, Jacob's sons, having heard the news, came in from the field. The men were distressed and very angry because he had committed an outrage in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing not to be done. And Hamor spoke with them, saying, "My son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Intermarry with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You will dwell among us, and the land will be open before you. Settle, move about, and acquire holdings in it." Jacob said to Simon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me, making me odious among the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My men are few in number, so that if they unite against me and attack me, I and my house will be destroyed." But they answered, "Should our sister be treated like a whore?"
Thank you. So I should have said those last two verses are after they go in and do all the slaughtering. And one other thing I just want to point out before getting into the questions is that that's sort of like an intense word to end on. Should our sister be treated as a whore, kezona? And really, I think what it's asking is, should she be treated like an unprotected woman, like a woman who doesn't have men who are supposed to be protecting her, controlling her sexuality, figuring out who she marries? That was its standard for women to be doing at that time, not making their own decisions around sexual agency. So with that, I have two questions. The first is, why might Hamor's offer, which is in verses 8 through 10, have been threatening rather than generous? He went there thinking he was giving a pretty generous bride price, and they clearly don't agree.
Well, maybe because, as Jacob said, Jacob's clan was smaller, and diffusing themselves among this larger clan, they would lose their identity.
Yeah.
And that might be Shechem's way of saying, sure, join us and we'll just absorb you and you will no longer be what you are.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like they're interested in letting them continue a distinct identity. And actually, just looking at the time, I'm going to skip to the next question so there's time for more open-ended stuff at the end, which is, why do you think that there is such a upsetting and unflattering story that's included in the Tanach? And what do you think we might be meant to learn from it?
I think the Tanakh is just filled with horrible stories. I mean, we're not, I don't think we're looking at the Tanakh and saying like, oh, this is what we should look up to. It's, oh, this is what we should learn from. And that means that we can learn, either from their mistakes and from their moral sins, or we can learn from the good and the, and the righteous and whatnot. So I think they include everything, because if they just included the good stories, then there might have been a gray area instead of saying this is bad.
I really appreciate that distinction between looking up to and learning from. I think that that's so important. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. And any last thoughts before I just share some other thoughts and open up for questions? Okay, so I will just end with some of my own general thoughts that I came away from my initial study of the Tanakh, and also I haven't really stopped since then. It's sort of become a bit of an obsession. But I think women in the Tanakh fill many different roles, as we've seen tonight, some of them that feel really empowering to like a modern reader, and some of them that don't. And I don't think that our goal should be to engage in like apologetics and just apologize for the parts of the book that don't feel good, or to judge the book as either like sexist or feminist or some very clear, distinct category, but to see that there are like nuance within its pages. And I think that nuance also reflects the nuance that we live with every day in our society. There are ways that we treat women really well, and that there's been a lot of progress, and other ways where that's just not true. And it's particularly hard to see texts in the Tanakh that like we judge and we're like, oh, that's not good. You're not treating the women there well. That doesn't feel equal or equitable. And then suddenly, right, they say if you point a finger, you have like four more pointing back at you. That if you look around our society, we actually reflect some of this book more than we would hope. And I really think a goal of using Tanakh for like justice and to get messages out of it is to say like, what in here do we not find palatable, and are there reflections of that still in our society that we can address, that we can work on, that we can do something about. So I will end there. We still have about 10 more minutes. Netta, yeah. If there are any questions that are totally outside of what I have presented or in any way related to it. And I'll maybe unspotlight myself so that people can
see each other. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
And you can choose to see the gallery view if you want to see little boxes, whatever you prefer. So if there's also a woman in mind, I guess, that you want to ask about, or you've always, this would be the place as well, because Chelsea did read the whole Tanach, but was the idea of spotlighting, specific women in order to bring up a discussion that we could do in an hour and not in, 5 or 20 sessions. It's a whole, we could talk about this for forever. So feel free to ask about that as well.
I would also say that the men in the Bible also have their flaws, and they're not portrayed as role models all the time either. And I think that's what makes it interesting and makes it alive, because we can have discussions about this thousands of years later, and it's still relevant and we can still learn from it. And this way it kind of shows at least some women are highlighted. They're not always in the background and they're not always nameless.
I think that that's a great point. And we definitely see that just in that last text where Shimon and Levi lie and then go commit mass murder. Like they're problematic too. There's a lot going on in this text. And even though there might be more male characters and more of a focus on male narratives, it's not exclusive, and we can sort of all be seen and read into this text.
Who are some of the other women that you would put into some of these characters? Not characters, categories. I was thinking, the first category, activist women, I was thinking of Yael.
Yeah, there's like another category that I'm thinking of, just like, can you create a category that's just named badasses? She is so cool.
Yeah.
And also a little bit murderous, but for good reasons.
Yeah.
There's like a lot of strength that's seen there.
Rachav.
She also would be doing what men can't. Same with Rachav.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And who might you put into the Jezebel category, or the Dinah category? Which other women might you put into some of those, into those two categories?
Yeah, I think for the Jezebel one, the sort of unredeemable women, it is a little bit smaller, but a lot of it, to be honest, is foreign women who like I don't
like
view
Delilah.
anything problematic,
like
but the text does. And is definitely very scared of. And I will just say, in addition, just because this wasn't all of the categories that I thought of, there's also one that is really focused on motherhood, which is a ton of women who just get a really quick blip that's like, and so gave birth to so-and-so, and that's all that you know about her. But it's also women like Sarah and like Leah and like Hannah, who fight tooth and nail, and all that they want is to like be mothers and to do their duty and to help continue on the nation, like none of which is possible. All those promises that God gave, you'll be as numerous as the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky, that can't happen without women who are pursuing this.
Yeah.
And just one last category that I think is important to highlight that is problematic is women who are really sort of fully defined and controlled by the men in their lives, which would take too long to do another text study, but there's Bat Yiftach, the daughter of Yiftach. If you have read Judges, if you've seen Game of Thrones, it's that but put into the Bible. It's like very bloody and there's a lot of violence there. But her dad basically makes a vow, and through no fault of her own, he then needs to burn her alive. And like, that's what happens. And it's this really upsetting, people think it might be sort of a polemic against child sacrifice and things like that. But there's just a lot of different ways that women show up in this book, and that they can be connected to each other. So really, I just encourage everyone to read more Torah, to read more Tanakh. It's awesome. There's a lot in
Are there any more questions?
Would be interested, although she's in the Megillah Esther, your view of Vashti.
Yeah, so Esther is included in Ketuvim in writing, so she totally counts in the Tanach. It's hard because so much about her is like midrash and outside of the text itself, and there's a lot of interpreting of what goes on. But this is a topic I did just like a one-on-one session with my great aunt because she wanted to learn about the women of Purim, and there's a lot to be said about Vashti. I think that she is probably also a woman who is doing something that a man around her can't. She's also quite competent, whether or not we like her, and however you view her as whether she's hero or villain or victim. She's married to a king who really is like an irresponsible frat boy. And she is asserting her power, or at least trying to. She gets outmaneuvered, but that I think is important. And I think you could also think of her as a woman who really is defined by the men in her life. Once she is not married, she no longer has that power and that position, which is its own problematic thing. Great question.
I'm also wondering about Lot's wife.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Who, is forced by her husband to flee, and then she gets sort of, looked down on, at least in the text or by the rabbis, for turning back. Like she has a little regret. She's leaving everybody. She's leaving her town, but she's a bad person for that. So I don't know. I sympathize with her.
100%. And there's this great essay, I'm trying to remember, it's a compilation of essays written by women about I think it's just the Torah. And I'm sorry I'm blanking on the name. If I remember it, I'll send it out to Netta. She can give it out. Or thank you for including my contact information. Or you can friend me on Facebook and I can message with you. There's this essay about how like maybe it's worth reinterpreting her as some type of heroic figure, that like what a lot of women have done traditionally in societies all over the world is to like hold memory of places that we've been, especially for a people that flees and moves around so much, and that really like holds tradition and holds memory. And maybe there's a way of reading Lot's wife like that by becoming this immovable pillar, that she's sort of insisting on the persistence of that memory. It's certainly a more like liberal interpretation of what's going on, but I did really appreciate the reread because I'm not sure that the punishment certainly doesn't seem fair to me or anatomically possible.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. And I'm glad that also additional women who are interesting got to be mentioned here as well. I'll ask if there's, one more question, because we do have 1 minute, and then I will finish. Does anybody have one more question?
I have a question. Do you, you referred to the red tent before? Mm-hmm. Obviously that's a fictional book, but based on the biblical characters. Do you think, though, that type of setup they had with the tent and with them all together and those types, the type of relationship they had, what's your feeling about how true that might have been? What's your guess?
That's a really good question. I think my understanding of sort of being like within the camp and outside of the camp is that we focus a lot on menstruation, in part because we still have things like mikveh today. See previous unorthodox sessions. But men could also be impure and need to be outside of the camp, whether you come into contact with a dead body or have a seminal emission, or there's like a bunch of things that could make a man also in that outside of the camp space. So I don't know whether like a women's only space seems so realistic to me, and that, Yeah, I guess I just don't know that I would have enough evidence to think that that is quite how it happened. Although, on the other hand, when Rachel steals her father's idols and doesn't want him to look in the camel bag that she's hidden them, she sits on it and says, I have my period. And then he like doesn't bother her. And so there, you know, I think that there's maybe evidence in both ways in the text of like, this wasn't only a women's space outside of the camp, but on the other hand, there does seem to be some touchiness around menstruation specifically that's there. So I'm really not quite sure, but I do know that Anita Diamond really did her homework on the book, and that any of the, you know, it's fictional, but it is like well-informed fiction. So I'd have to track down more sources, but that's a great question.
Great. And with that, I will just refer people to either send me an email or reach out to Chelsea via Facebook if you have any more questions. And I think that really this can be discussed and a lot more in depth. So I really want to thank Chelsea for joining us today. And if anybody here is interested in the recording, I'm happy to send it to you. And I also want to say that my next few sessions will be in September already, a high holiday workshop and Israel's most daring operations. But the next one about women in Judaism will be in November, as I said. So you'll have the whole year to look forward to these type of sessions about women in Judaism. So thank you so much to everyone who joined. It's really nice to see that even in August as well. I know people are going away or not going away, but that people still have patience to go on Zoom and have discussions like this. It's really meaningful. And I wish you all a good night. And I hope that I will be able to actually perhaps see you in the near future as well. And Laila Tov to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Netta.
Bye, everyone.
Shabbat shalom to everybody.
Shabbat shalom. Yes, yes.
Shabbat shalom. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you, Netta.
Thank you, Netta.
Wonderful.
And Chelsea. Thank you.
Chelsea. Yes, definitely.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.